So let's talk a bit about analyzing data. So first and foremost, when we talk about fraud, it's important to understand how is fraud detected. So when you look at the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners report, the number one detection for fraud is through tips. So whether the coworkers or somebody in the community reports that they believe fraud might be taking place. So that is always going to be the highest number of cases. The next highest number that you're going to see, there's two numbers here that I want to point out to you. There's internal audits that represent about 15% of the times that internal audits have found that fraud was taking place, and your external audit. Now, many organizations and many community members don't realize that an external audit is not intended to detect fraud. And if you notice here in this particular chart, it's showing that an external audit only identified fraud 4% of the time. Internal audits obviously have more opportunity to identify when fraud is occurring. And in that case, you'll see that about 15% of the frauds that were examined were identified due to an internal audit. So why is it important for us to do data analytics and data analysis? What we want to be able to do is convert the number of frauds that are found by accident, somebody stumbling over them, or the number of frauds that are not being found through external audits or internal audits. You want to find it on your terms, not on somebody else's terms. So all organizations really should be performing this data analytics. And why should we analyze our data? So as we talked about earlier, we of course want to prevent fraud. We want to prevent misuse of the limited resources that we have. And of course, we want to detect errors. So when we look at this, conducting some sort of a surprise audit or a surprise review of transactions are very effective yet underutilized. In that Association of Certified Fraud Examiners report that I referenced, in the organizations that did have fraud occur, it is reported that less than 30% of those victims actually were conducting any sort of a surprise audit within their organization. The concept of conducting surprise audits will allow you to lower the fraud risks and increase the opportunity for detection. And as I mentioned earlier, perception of detection. So when individuals believe that their work is being looked at in a different way, when they believe that their data is going to be analyzed in a more precise format, they are less likely to feel that they have an opportunity to conduct that fraud. So let's dig in and talk about some of these different areas that we're going to focus in on. So we're going to talk a bit about how can you look at your purchasing and payables data, how can you look at your payroll data, and how can you look at your general ledger data in more detail rather than just running the standard reports that you look at. And we know that in many of our organizations, there's a lot of data to comb through. So what I'm going to point out to you is what are some specific areas in each of these different functional areas that you can look at your data in a more refined format. So we're going to start with purchasing and payables. So to look at purchasing and payables, some of the areas that you can analyze in a little bit more detail is looking for duplicated payments. Look for rounded dollar amounts. Some of you may be wondering, well, why would we be interested in rounded dollar amounts? I'm going to share that with you. Look at your procurement thresholds. Look at the volume, not just the dollar volume that's being paid to a particular vendor, but the frequency of payments to a vendor. And then also look at what are those amounts that are being paid and is it above average by doing some year-over-year analysis. So let's start by talking a little bit about rounded amounts. I'm going to start with that particular bullet point.